Philadelphes, the forgotten Esoteric Brotherhood of France, explained. The French Revolution was a fire that burned away 1,000 years of history. It was an age of reason, of radical politics, of a new world being born in blood and terror. We think we know its story, a story of Jacobins and guillotines, of public squares and political pamphlets. But what if there was another revolution happening in the shadows? A secret war fought not just for political liberty, but for spiritual enlightenment. In the Masonic lodges, military garrisons, and esoteric circles of revolutionary France, a name was whispered, a name that spoke of universal brotherhood and ancient wisdom. They were a hydra-headed secret society, a ghost network of soldiers, mystics, and plotters who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. They sought to create not just a new republic, but a new man. They called themselves the Philadelphes, brotherly lovers. Were they a genuine, unified secret order pulling the strings of history? Were they a phantom, a convenient label for a dozen disconnected conspiracies? Or were they something else entirely? The secret, mystical heart of the revolution itself. This is the story of the Philadelphes, the forgotten esoteric societies of the Napoleonic age. To understand a revolution, you must first understand the world it seeks to destroy and the world it dreams of creating. And to understand a secret society born from that revolution, you must look into the shadows cast by its brightest lights. Our story begins in the crucible of late 18th century France, an age of profound and violent contradictions, a society teetering on the brink of immolating itself. It was a world saturated with both the pure, cold light of reason and the deep, mystical shadows of the occult. And it was in the fusion of this light and this shadow that the conditions for a new kind of secret society were forged. On the surface, this was the great climax of the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason. It was a time of immense intellectual optimism. The great French philosophes Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau had become intellectual superstars. Their weapon was reason, and their enemy was what they called l'infâme, the infamous thing. The combined power of an absolute monarchy, which claimed to rule by divine right, and a Catholic Church, which they saw as a corrupt institution built on superstition and ignorance. They championed a new worldview, one based not on faith and tradition, but on logic, empirical evidence, and natural law. They argued for religious tolerance, for freedom of speech, and for the fundamental rights of man. Their great collaborative project, the Encyclopedia, was a monumental attempt to catalog all human knowledge, to organize the world according to rational principles, and to make that knowledge available to all. It was a declaration that humanity, through the power of its own intellect, could understand the universe and perfect its own society. The future, it seemed, would be a well-lit and perfectly ordered garden of reason. But as the official lights of reason burned ever brighter, the shadows they cast grew longer and deeper. And in those shadows, a very different kind of enlightenment was being sought. For every Parisian intellectual reading Voltaire, there was another attending a séance, consulting a fortune-teller, or seeking initiation into a mystical order. The same age that worshipped reason was also experiencing a massive popular explosion of interest in the irrational, the supernatural, and the occult. The greatest sensation of the era was mesmerism. An Austrian physician named Franz Anton Mesmer arrived in Paris and took the city by storm. He claimed to have discovered a universal, invisible fluid called animal magnetism. Sickness, he argued, was caused by blockages in the flow of this fluid through the body. Mesmer claimed he could manipulate this fluid, curing all manner of ailments. His healing sessions were extraordinary pieces of public theater. Patients would gather around a large wooden tub, a baquet, filled with magnetized water and iron filings. They would hold onto iron rods protruding from the tub while music played, and Mesmer, dressed in a lilac silk robe, would pass among them, staring into their eyes and making passes with his hands. Many of his patients would fall into convulsive fits, known as crises, after which they claimed to be cured. Mesmerism was a sensation. It was a scientific form of magic, a natural miracle that seemed to offer proof of unseen forces, a spiritual reality that the rationalist philosophers denied. And then there was the man who called himself Count Alessandro di Cagliostro, a figure of immense charisma and profound mystery. Cagliostro claimed to be an immortal adept, a Rosicrucian master who had lived for centuries. He was a hypnotist, an alchemist, a faith healer, and a brilliant charlatan. He founded his own Egyptian rite of Freemasonry, an elaborate, theatrical system that admitted both men and women, and which promised to teach them the secrets of physical regeneration and spiritual immortality. For a time, he was one of the most celebrated men in France, a living embodiment of the age's thirst for magic and mystery. Alongside these flamboyant figures, a quieter but more intellectually profound mystical current was flowing. This was Martinism, a form of esoteric Christianity based on the teachings of Louis Claude de Saint Martin. Saint Martin taught that humanity had fallen from a state of primordial, divine unity, and was now living in a state of exile. The purpose of life, and the goal of his initiatory path, was the reintegration of the individual soul with its divine source. It was a deeply mystical and philosophical path, appealing to those who found both the established church and the new atheism to be spiritually empty. Weaving through all these currents, the rational, the magical, and the mystical was the single most important network of the 18th century, Freemasonry. By the 1780s, the Masonic lodges of France were at the peak of their influence. They were a unique social space. In a society rigidly divided by class, the lodge was one of the few places where a liberal nobleman, a bourgeois lawyer, and a radical intellectual could meet on the level as brothers, and freely discuss the dangerous new ideas that were sweeping through Europe. They were laboratories for the practice of equality and the debate of liberty. The very ideals of the coming revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternite, were the core principles of the Masonic Lodge. But French Freemasonry was not a single, unified movement. It was a vast, tangled, and fiercely competitive ecosystem of different rites and obediences. Beyond the three basic degrees of apprentice, fellowcraft, and master mason, a bewildering array of high degrees had been created, each with its own elaborate rituals, its own complex philosophy, and its own claim to a more ancient and more authentic wisdom. There were Scottish rites, which often claimed a lineage from the Knights Templar. There were Rosicrucian degrees, focused on alchemy and Christian mysticism. And there were the new, popular Egyptian rites, like Cagliostro's, which drew on the burgeoning fascination with ancient Egypt. These high-degree lodges were hotbeds of esoteric speculation and, often, of political plotting. They were societies within societies, secret circles where the most ambitious and radical ideas of the age were being nurtured. This, then, was the crucible of late 18th century France. A world pulled in opposing directions. A society that championed both the cold, hard light of scientific reason and the shadowy, enchanted world of the occult. An age that was simultaneously dismantling the old religion and desperately searching for a new one. When the French Revolution exploded in 1789, it was not the simple triumph of reason over superstition, as the philosophes might have hoped. It was a far more complex and chaotic event. The political and the mystical, the rational and the irrational, did not cancel each other out. They merged. They flowed together in the same channels. The political clubs of the Jacobins were structured like Masonic lodges. The new revolutionary festivals were filled with esoteric symbolism. And the men who would lead the revolutionary armies, who would fight and die for the new republic, were often the very same men who were seeking initiation into the mysteries of Martinism or the rites of Egyptian Freemasonry. They believed they were engaged in more than just a political struggle. They believed they were participating in a great work of spiritual regeneration. They were not just trying to create a new government. They were trying to create a new, perfected kind of human being. It was from this potent, volatile, and deeply strange fusion of revolutionary politics and esoteric spirituality that a new kind of secret society would be born. A society that took its name from the ideal of brotherly love, but whose work would involve conspiracy, rebellion, and a secret war for the soul of the new age. The Philadelphes were about to step out of the shadows. To hunt for the Philadelphes is to hunt for a ghost. It is to chase a whisper through the labyrinthine corridors of revolutionary and Napoleonic France. They are a historian's nightmare. A secret society so secretive that, even today, we cannot be entirely sure of its true nature, its ultimate aims, or even if it existed as a single coherent entity at all. Unlike the Rosicrucians, they left behind no public manifestos. Unlike the Illuminati, their internal papers were never seized and published by the state. Our knowledge of them comes from a handful of strange, romantic, and deeply unreliable sources. The memoirs of disillusioned former members, the feverish reports of conspiracy theorists, and the terse, suspicious notes of Napoleon's secret police. To piece together their story is to assemble a mosaic from broken shards of glass. The picture that emerges is not of a single, monolithic organization, but of something far more complex and fluid. The Philadelphes were not a single beast, but a hydra, the mythical serpent with many heads. Each head had its own character, its own agenda, and its own territory. The only thing that united them was a shared name, and a shared, burning desire to remake the world. Our principal, and most problematic, guide into the shadowy world is a remarkable book published in 1813 by a brilliant and eccentric French writer named Charles Nodier. Nodier's Histoire des Sociétés Secrètes de l'Armée sous Napoléon, History of the Secret Societies of the Army under Napoleones, the foundational text of the Philadelphian myth. Nodier was a man of letters, a future member of the prestigious Académie Française, and a romantic who was fascinated by the Gothic and the occult. In his book, he claimed to have been, in his youth, a member of one of these societies, and to be revealing its secrets to the world. The picture he paints is of a vast, ancient, and powerful international order. He traces the origins of the Philadelphes back to the pre-revolutionary Masonic and Martinist circles of Lyon, a city that was a great center of French esotericism. He presents them as a high-minded initiatory society, a college of initiates, whose true purpose was not merely political, but spiritual and philosophical. According to Nodier, the Philadelphes sought nothing less than a universal regeneration. They believed the French Revolution was only the first violent and messy stage of a much grander transformation. Their ultimate goal was to establish a new, universal republic, a utopian society based on the esoteric principles of liberty, equality, and a universal, syncretic religion that would unite all of humanity. Their philosophy, he claims, was a potent blend of Christian mysticism derived from St. Martin, ancient Gnosticism, and the secret wisdom of the Greek and Egyptian mystery schools. Nodier describes a complex, hierarchical structure, with an outer circle of members who were focused on political action, and an inner, secret circle of high adepts who understood the deeper, mystical purpose of the great work. It is a compelling and romantic vision of philosopher revolutionaries, working silently behind the scenes of history. Another, even more fantastical, account comes from the writings of Jean-Baptiste Claude Izoard, a revolutionary pamphleteer who wrote under the pseudonym Nicolas de Bonneville. Bonneville was a key figure in a pre-revolutionary intellectual circle in Paris, known as the Cercle Social, or the Social Circle, which sought to blend radical democratic politics with esoteric Freemasonry. In his writings, Bonneville weaves an even grander and more ancient lineage for the Philadelphes. He claimed they were the direct, secret heirs of the most famous and tragic of all secret societies, the Knights Templar. He argued that when the Templar order was brutally suppressed by the King of France and the Pope in the 14th century, its highest initiates went underground, passing on their secret anti-papal and anti-monarchical doctrine through a hidden chain of succession. The Philadelphes, in his telling, were simply the latest incarnation of this centuries-old conspiracy. Their ultimate goal, he claimed, was the final, total destruction of both the throne and the altar, the twin pillars of tyranny that had destroyed their Templar ancestors. How much of this can we believe? Nodier and Bonneville were romantics, men writing in a literary tradition that prized imagination and grand narrative over strict, factual accuracy. Their accounts are almost certainly embellished, a fusion of personal experience, rumor, and pure literary invention. They created a powerful myth, but it is a myth that obscures the more complex historical reality. However, if we turn from these romantic histories to the cold, dry records of Napoleon's ruthlessly efficient secret police, we find evidence that something real and dangerous lay behind the myth. The name Philadelphes appears repeatedly in police reports from the early 1800s. Napoleon's Minister of Police, the feared Joseph Fouché, was obsessed with these secret societies. His spies reported on the activities of Philadelphian lodges in Paris, in the military garrisons of provincial France, and even as far away as the French-controlled territories in Italy. But the police reports do not describe a single, unified international order. Instead, they describe a confusing and shifting landscape of different, often disconnected, secret cells. There was a group in Paris centered around a Masonic lodge. There was a separate, more radical group in the Jura region of eastern France, known as the Philadelphes of Besançon. And there were numerous cells within the army itself, each with its own local leadership and its own particular shade of revolutionary ideology. The name Philadelph seems to have been less the title of a specific organization, and more of a revolutionary brand, a shared banner under which a variety of different radical groups could operate. It was a name that signified a certain set of ideals, a commitment to republicanism, a hatred of Napoleon's imperial tyranny, and often, an interest in esoteric philosophy and ritual as a tool for binding the conspirators together. It was a hydra, a beast with many heads, and each head, while part of the same monstrous body of opposition, seemed to have a mind of its own. One head was that of a political plotter dreaming of a republican constitution. Another was that of a mystical philosopher, dreaming of a universal religion. One sought to change the government. The other sought to change humanity itself. The great, unanswered question is whether these heads ever truly acted in unison, guided by a single secret heart. Or were they simply a collection of separate creatures, all coincidentally given the same name by a world that struggled to understand them? This fundamental ambiguity is the key to the Philadelphian mystery. While some who called themselves Philadelphes were dreaming of a mystical utopia, another, more dangerous branch of the Hydra was sharpening its knives. For this group, the revolution was not a spiritual metaphor. It was a political reality that had been stolen, and their aim was not the enlightenment of humanity, but the death of a tyrant. This was the most historically verifiable face of the Philadelphes, a secret brotherhood of soldiers, a republican dagger pointed directly at the heart of the Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. To understand this deep-seated opposition, we must remember what the French army was. It was not a traditional royal army of mercenaries and aristocrats. It was a new and revolutionary creation, an army of the people, forged in the fires of the French Revolution. Its soldiers and, most importantly, many of its officers were true believers. They had fought and bled across Europe not for a king, but for an idea, the Republic. They were fiercely proud, ideologically driven men who saw themselves as armed missionaries of liberty. And then, in 1804, their hero betrayed them. Napoleon Bonaparte, the first consul of the Republic, the man they had followed to glory, did the unthinkable. In a lavish ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral, he crowned himself Emperor of the French. For the army's hardcore Republicans, this was the ultimate act of treason. Napoleon had not saved the revolution. He had murdered it. He had taken the hard-won liberty of the French people and wrapped it in the gaudy trappings of the very monarchy they had overthrown. He was a new Caesar, a new Charlemagne, a new tyrant. But Napoleon's power was now absolute. Open dissent was impossible. It meant demotion, exile, or a quiet execution. And so, the opposition went underground. And its natural home was the one place that was both the crucible of revolutionary fervor and a breeding ground for secret societies, the Masonic lodges of the military. The Philadelphes, or the groups that used that name, became a key network for this military discontent. The lodge meetings provided the perfect cover. Behind the closed doors of the temple, under the guise of performing Masonic ritual, Republican officers could safely meet, identify like-minded brothers, and plot against the new emperor. The symbolism of Freemasonry, with its allegories of slaying tyrants and building a new temple for humanity, provided a ready-made language for their revolutionary aspirations. The great figurehead for this Republican opposition was General Jean-Victor Moreau. Moreau was one of the most brilliant and popular generals of the Revolutionary Wars. He was Napoleon's chief rival, a man whose military talent was seen by many as equal, if not superior, to Bonaparte's own. But unlike Napoleon, Moreau was a steadfast and committed Republican. He made no secret of his disdain for Napoleon's growing dictatorial power. This made him a natural rallying point for all those who were disaffected with the new regime. In 1804, he was implicated in a royalist plot to overthrow Napoleon, a conspiracy led by a man named Georges Cadoudal. Moreau's involvement was likely minimal. Was a Republican. Not a royalist, but it provided Napoleon with the perfect pretext to eliminate his most dangerous rival. Moreau was arrested and put on a great show trial. The evidence was flimsy, but he was found guilty. Napoleon, not wanting to create a martyr by executing such a popular general, commuted the sentence to exile. Moreau was forced to leave France for America. The conspiratorial writers of the 19th century, like Charles Nodier, would later claim that Moreau was the secret Grand Master of the Philadelphes, and that his exile only strengthened the order's resolve to destroy the emperor who had wronged their leader. With Moreau gone, the leadership of the military conspiracies fell to more extreme and fanatical figures. The most important of these was a man named Claude François de Mallet. Mallet was a general of more principle than talent. He was an unreconstructed Republican, a man who had never accepted Napoleon's authority and who had been involved in anti-Bonapartist plots from the very beginning. His plotting led to his arrest and imprisonment in 1808. But for a man like Mallet, prison was not a deterrent. It was an opportunity. Behind bars, he was surrounded by other political prisoners, other disaffected Republicans, and other members of the Philadelphian network. And in this hothouse of conspiracy, he began to dream. He became obsessed with a single, audacious idea: to bring down the entire Napoleonic Empire with a single, well-aimed lie. He understood the great weakness of Napoleon's regime. It was an empire built entirely on the life and genius of one man. If that man were to disappear, the entire structure could collapse. Mallet's plan was therefore one of brilliant simplicity. He would announce to Paris that Napoleon was dead. For years, in his prison cell, he meticulously prepared his coup. He studied the workings of the Parisian government. He cultivated contacts within the military garrison of the city. And, most importantly, he and his fellow conspirators forged a set of perfect documents. Decrees supposedly from the Senate announcing the emperor's death in battle, abolishing the empire, and establishing a new provisional republican government. This was not a plan for a mass uprising. It was a plan for a swift surgical strike, a coup d'état that relied on the discipline of the army and the confusion of the authorities. It was a plot that could only have been conceived and planned within the confines of a disciplined, secret military network. This was to be the Philadelphia's great moment, the Republican dagger finally striking at the emperor's throat. The perfect opportunity arrived in the autumn of 1812. Napoleon and his vast Grande Armée were more than 2,000 miles away, bogged down in the vast, frozen emptiness of Russia. News from the front was slow and unreliable. Paris was anxious, filled with rumors of disaster. On the night of October 22nd, Mallet and his co-conspirators escaped from their light security prison. Mallet put on his full general's uniform, a symbol of legitimate authority. In the pre-dawn hours of October 23rd, he presented himself at the barracks of the Paris National Guard. He calmly announced his fabricated news. The emperor is dead. He informed the commanding officer that Napoleon had been killed outside Moscow on October 7th. He then produced his masterfully forged documents from the Senate, which confirmed the news and, more importantly, contained a list of promotions for the very officers he was speaking to. The officers, completely taken in by Mallet's authoritative bearing and the promise of promotion, did not hesitate. They placed their troops at his command. The first stage of the coup had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. Mallet then marched his new troops across Paris, repeating the performance. He went to La Force prison, used his forged orders to release 2 other key generals who were part of his plot, and sent them off to arrest the highest officials of the imperial government. The minister of police and the prefect of Paris were roused from their beds and arrested without a struggle. For a few extraordinary hours, it seemed the impossible was happening. A handful of conspirators, armed with nothing more than a lie, had effectively decapitated the government of the most powerful empire in the world. The Philadelphian dagger was at the throat of the regime. The republic, it seemed, was about to be reborn, but the conspiracy was about to unravel due to a single unforeseen act of resistance. While one head of the Philadelphian Hydra was plotting revolution with the Republican dagger, another head was dreaming a very different kind of dream. This was the mystical wing of the movement, a branch whose ambitions were not merely political but cosmic. They sought not just to reform the government of France, but to restore a lost golden age of spiritual wisdom for all humanity. And the source of that wisdom, they believed, lay in the sands of a single, ancient land, Egypt. The end of the 18th century saw Europe gripped by a fervent Egyptomania. This fascination was ignited by Napoleon Bonaparte's audacious invasion of Egypt in 1798. While the military campaign itself was ultimately a failure, its cultural and intellectual impact was immense. Napoleon did not just bring soldiers with him. He brought an army of 167 savant scientists, engineers, artists, and scholars. Their mission was to conduct the first great scientific survey of the land of the pharaohs. They measured the pyramids, copied the inscriptions from the temples of Luxor and Karnak, and documented the flora, fauna, and customs of the land. Their findings, eventually published in the monumental, multi-volume description De L'Egypte, revealed to Europe a civilization of breathtaking antiquity, mathematical precision, and profound spiritual mystery. For the esotericists and Freemasons of Europe, this was a revelation of intoxicating power. They saw Egypt not as a dead civilization, but as the living source of all secret knowledge. They believed that the great philosophers of Greece, like Pythagoras and Plato, had been initiated into the Egyptian mysteries. They believed that Moses had learned his wisdom from the Egyptian priesthood. They saw the hieroglyphs not as a historical language, but as a secret, symbolic code that contained the keys to alchemy, astrology, and high magic. Egypt became the new, ultimate source of Masonic legitimacy. To claim a lineage from the builders of the pyramids was to claim a wisdom far more ancient and pure than that of the Knights Templar or the medieval stonemasons. And in the wake of Napoleon's expedition, a host of new, Egyptian Masonic rites began to spring up, each claiming to be the true repository of this ancient pharaonic wisdom. The most important, influential, and enduring of these new systems would be directly linked to the shadowy network of the Philadelphes. It was called the Rite of Memphis. According to its own traditional history, the Rite of Memphis was founded in 1813 by men who had been there at the source. They were French soldiers and masons, led by a man named Samuel Hannis, who had been part of Napoleon's army in Egypt. They claimed that while in Egypt, they had made contact with a surviving, secret tradition of the ancient mysteries, and had been granted the authority to bring it back to Europe. Upon their return to France, they established their new Masonic system in the city of Montauban. They named it for Memphis, the ancient capital of Lower Egypt, a great religious and political center. The rite was later developed and promoted by other key figures, most notably Gabriel Mathieu Marconis de Niger and his son, Jacques-Étienne Marconis de Niger, who would become its great propagandist. What connected it to the Philadelphes? The founders and early leaders of the Rite of Memphis were all deeply involved in the very same esoteric and military Masonic circles that nurtured the Philadelphian conspiracies. They were part of the same underground stream. The Rite of Memphis can be seen as the formal, ritualistic expression of the Philadelphes' more mystical and spiritual ambitions. While their political brothers were plotting to overthrow a temporal emperor, the Philadelphes of Memphis were seeking to establish a new spiritual empire. The system they created was vast, complex, and deliberately eclectic. If standard Freemasonry had 3 degrees, The Rite of Memphis, in its fullest form, had over 90. It was a complete encyclopedia of Western esotericism, a great initiatory ladder designed to guide the candidate from the mundane world to the highest peaks of spiritual illumination. Its degrees were divided into a series of classes or colleges. The lower degrees were largely based on standard Masonic symbolism, telling the allegorical story of the building of Solomon's temple. But as the initiate ascended, the teachings became more explicitly esoteric. There were degrees based on the Greek mystery schools, on the philosophy of the Gnostics, and on the doctrines of the Neoplatonists. There were degrees focused on the Hermetic sciences, teaching the principles of alchemy and astrology. There was a whole section dedicated to the Knights Templar, which taught the true, hidden history of their order. There were Rosicrucian degrees, which revealed the secrets of spiritual regeneration. And at its highest levels, the Sanctuary of Memphis, the initiate was supposedly taught the ultimate secrets of the universe and achieved a state of divine gnosis. The rituals of the Rite of Memphis were famous for their theatricality and their rich, syncretic symbolism. The lodge was no longer just a representation of Solomon's temple. It was an Egyptian temple. The officers of the lodge were not just the master and wardens. They were hierophants and priests of Isis. The symbolism was a dizzying blend of the Masonic square and compass, the Rosicrucian rose and cross, the alchemical serpent, and the Egyptian Ankh and Eye of Horus. The philosophy of the rite was just as ambitious. It was not merely about creating good men or promoting social charity. Its goal was nothing less than the spiritual regeneration of humanity. The Philadelphes of Memphis believed they were the inheritors of an unbroken chain of initiation, a philosophia perennis or perennial philosophy that had been passed down in secret from the first priest-kings of ancient Egypt. They believed it was their destiny to usher in a new golden age, a new theocratic empire for the entire world. But this would not be a theocracy ruled by the Pope in Rome. It would be a spiritual empire guided by a new priesthood of enlightened initiates, the high-degree adepts of their own order. Theirs was a vision that was, in its own way, just as revolutionary as that of their political brethren. They sought to replace the authority of both kings and priests with a new, spiritual authority, a hierarchy based not on birth or dogma, but on esoteric initiation and enlightenment. Thus, the Hydra had two heads, seemingly pointed in opposite directions. The political Philadelphes dreamed of a secular, democratic republic born from the rationalist ideals of the Enlightenment. The mystical Philadelphes of Memphis dreamed of a sacred, hierarchical empire born from the occult wisdom of ancient Egypt. One sought to liberate man in the political sphere, the other sought to deify him in the spiritual sphere. The great, unanswered question remains: were these two movements truly at odds? Or were they, as Nodier and others claimed, two sides of the same coin, two different wings of a single, complex conspiracy to overturn the old world and build a new one in its place? This fundamental duality, this tension between the Republican dagger and the mystical right, is the central enigma of the Philadelphian legacy. A dagger pointed at the emperor's heart, a mystical right aimed at the soul of humanity. We have seen the two faces of the Philadelphian movement, the hard-edged political conspiracy and the fantastical esoteric dream. Historically, they appear as separate parallel streams. But what if they were not separate at all? What if they were two wings of a single, unified secret army, fighting a war on two fronts? This is the grand, romantic vision presented by our most important and most imaginative source, Charles Nodier. In his History of the Secret Societies of the Army, Nodier doesn't just describe a collection of disconnected cells. He paints a picture of a single, cohesive, and deeply powerful order, a true Philadelphian brotherhood, with a dual agenda. And he describes a secret war, a subterranean struggle for the soul of the French Empire, fought not on the battlefields of Europe, but in the corridors of power, in the clandestine meetings of the lodge, and even on the astral plane itself. According to Nodier, the Philadelphian order had a sophisticated, layered structure. The outer circle, he claimed, consisted of the Republican idealists and military plotters. They were the foot soldiers, the men of action, driven by a political hatred of Napoleon's tyranny. But the true leadership, the inner circle, was composed of high-grade initiates who understood the deeper, mystical purpose of the revolution. For them, the overthrow of Napoleon was not an end in itself, but merely a necessary first step towards a universal regeneration, a complete spiritual transformation of society. Nodier claims this unified order was so influential that it had penetrated the very highest levels of the Napoleonic state. He depicts the imperial court itself as a battleground between two opposing forces, two rival esoteric currents. On one side stood Napoleon Bonaparte himself. Napoleon, while a product of the revolution, was also a man of order, of pragmatism, of a rational, almost mathematical view of power. He was deeply suspicious of secret societies, of mystics, of any ideology he could not personally control. He had established his own powerful secret police, led by the ruthless Joseph Fouché, to hunt down and suppress these very networks. Napoleon represented the new, secular, centralized state. On the other side, Nodier places a surprising and fascinating figure, the Empress Josephine. Josephine de Beauharnais, Napoleon's wife, was a woman born in the Caribbean colony of Martinique, a world steeped in folklore and syncretic spirituality. She was famously and deeply superstitious. She surrounded herself with mystics. She consulted fortune-tellers, most famously the celebrated cartomancer Mademoiselle Lenormandin. She was known to be a patron and protector of esotericists. In Nodier's telling, Josephine was more than just a dabbler. She was the secret, high-level protectress of the Philadelphes and other mystical societies within the court. She was the great patroness of the regenerative vision, standing in direct opposition to her husband's purely political and military ambition. The imperial couple's personal and political struggles, in this view, were a mirror of a greater, hidden war between two worldviews: the path of earthly empire versus the path of spiritual enlightenment. This subterranean war, Nodier claims, reached its dramatic and decisive climax in the year 1808. By this point, Napoleon's ambition seemed boundless. He had invaded Spain, placing his own brother on the Spanish throne, and was becoming increasingly tyrannical at home. For the Philadelphes, the final line had been crossed. The hero of the Republic had become its gravedigger. Nodier describes a secret Supreme Council of the Order being convened. It was a clandestine tribunal held in the dead of night, and on the agenda was a single item: the judgment of the emperor. According to this extraordinary account, the Philadelphes put Napoleon Bonaparte on trial in absentia. They charged him with the ultimate crimes: betraying the promise of the revolution, destroying the Republic, and establishing a new form of tyranny. The verdict was unanimous: guilty. But what was the sentence to be? The political wing of the order screamed for assassination. They wanted to kill the man himself. But the high initiates, Nodier claims, argued for a different, more profound form of justice. To simply kill the man would be crude. It would turn him into a martyr and might not solve the problem. They had to kill the source of his power. They had to destroy his destiny. And so, the council pronounced its sentence. It was not a physical execution, but a magical one. They condemned Napoleon to la mort magique, magical death. Nodier describes a powerful, solemn ritual being performed, a ceremony designed to psychically cut Napoleon off from his providential star, the source of his incredible luck, his charisma, his almost supernatural record of victory. It was an act of high magic, an astral attack aimed at the very soul of his empire. From this moment forward, Nodier argues, Napoleon's fortunes took a dramatic and irreversible turn. The invincible general suddenly began to make catastrophic errors of judgment. The disastrous, bleeding ulcer of the Peninsular War in Spain began to drain his resources. And then came the ultimate hubris, the fatal mistake: the invasion of Russia in 1812. The horrific retreat from Moscow, the destruction of his magnificent Grande Armée, the loss of hundreds of thousands of his veteran soldiers in the ice and snow, all of this, in Nodier's telling, was the direct result of that secret ritual performed 4 years earlier. The Philadelphes, unable to reach the emperor's body, had successfully attacked his soul. They had extinguished his star. The final defeats at Leipzig and Waterloo were merely the inevitable, physical playing out of a battle that had already been lost on the spiritual plane. It is a fantastic, spellbinding story. It transforms the messy, contingent chaos of history into a grand, occult melodrama, a secret war between initiates and a tyrant. Is it true? In any literal, historical sense, almost certainly not. There is no independent evidence for this Supreme Council or its ritual of magical death. It is a product of Nodier's own fertile, romantic, and Gothic imagination. He was writing in the aftermath of the Napoleonic epic, trying to give a deeper, hidden meaning to the almost unbelievable rise and fall of this world historical figure. But like all powerful myths, it contains a symbolic truth. It speaks to the profound desire of the age to believe that history was more than just a story of politics and armies. It reflects a widespread belief in hidden forces, in a subterranean war being fought for the destiny of Europe. And it reveals the core philosophy of the mystical Philadelphes, the belief that the inner spiritual world is the ultimate cause and the outer material world is merely its effect. To change the world, you must first change the consciousness that creates it. Whether or not they truly believed they could kill Napoleon's destiny, the story itself is a testament to the power of their worldview. While the mystics of the Philadelphian network may have been fighting their war on the astral plane, its political soldiers were preparing for a far more direct and tangible assault. The romantic tales of magical death and secret councils may be the stuff of legend, but the Philadelphes' involvement in real-world, high-stakes political conspiracy was deadly serious. And the greatest proof of their audacity and their reach is found in the extraordinary affair of 1812, a plot so daring, so brilliantly simple, and so nearly successful that it shook the Napoleonic Empire to its very foundations. This was the conspiracy of General Claude François de Mallet. General Mallet was not one of Napoleon's celebrated, high-flying marshals. He was a career officer of mediocre talent but of ferocious, unshakable principle. He was an old-school revolutionary, a die-hard Republican who had never forgiven Napoleon for crowning himself emperor. He saw Bonaparte as a tyrant, a Corsican usurper, who had hijacked the French Revolution for his own personal glory. His open opposition and his involvement in previous Republican plots had earned him the emperor's distrust. By 1812, he was no longer in command of troops. He was a political prisoner, held under light supervision in a medical asylum on the outskirts of Paris. But for a man like Mallet, prison was not a cage. It was an incubator. He was surrounded by other disaffected political prisoners, other forgotten generals, other radical Republicans, other men who dreamed of the emperor's downfall. And in this hothouse of conspiracy, Mallet's obsessive, single-minded plan began to take its final, perfect shape. He had long understood the fundamental vulnerability of Napoleon's autocratic regime. The entire edifice of the French Empire, its laws, its army, its government rested on the life of a single man. The emperor's word was law. But what if the emperor could no longer speak? What if he were dead? Mallet's plan was built on this simple, powerful premise. He would not try to kill Napoleon. He would simply announce that Napoleon was already dead. For years, Mallet and his co-conspirators, including a royalist priest named Abbé Lafon, worked on the details of their plot. Their preparations were meticulous. The centerpiece of the conspiracy was a collection of masterfully forged documents. They created a perfectly fabricated Senatus Consult, a decree supposedly issued by the French Senate. This document announced that Napoleon Bonaparte had died of a fever outside Moscow on October 7th. It then declared the imperial government abolished. And it announced the formation of a new, provisional Republican government, with General Moreau, the exiled Republican hero, as its president. Most importantly, it appointed General Mallet himself as the commander of the 17th Military Division, the military governor of Paris, with absolute authority over all troops in the capital. To make the bait irresistible, the documents also contained a list of promotions for key officers in the Paris garrison. It was a brilliantly conceived psychological trap. It was designed to exploit the army's rigid culture of discipline and obedience to written orders from a superior authority. The plan was ready. All Mallet needed was the right moment to spring it. That moment arrived in the autumn of 1812. Napoleon and his magnificent Grande Armée, over 500,000 strong, were thousands of miles away, lost in the immensity of Russia. After a bloody and inconclusive battle at Borodino, they had occupied Moscow, only to find it a deserted, burning city. As the brutal Russian winter closed in, the army was forced into one of the most catastrophic retreats in military history. News from the front was slow, censored, and unreliable. But rumors of disaster were filtering back to Paris. The capital was anxious. The Empress Marie-Louise and the infant King of Rome were in residence. But the government was fragile, its authority entirely dependent on the survival of the absent emperor. The city was a powder keg of anxiety, waiting for a spark. Mallet knew his time had come. On the night of October 22nd, Mallet, along with Abbé Lafon and another conspirator, simply walked out of their asylum. Mallet put on his full, immaculate general's uniform. He was no longer a prisoner. He was the self-appointed savior of the Republic. In the pre-dawn darkness of October 23rd, the coup began. Mallet proceeded to the Popincourt barracks, home to the 10th cohort of the Paris National Guard. He strode into the quarters of the commanding officer, Colonel Soulier. He woke the colonel from his sleep and announced his devastating, fabricated news. "General, the emperor is dead." He presented his forged papers from the Senate. The sleepy and bewildered colonel, seeing a uniformed general in his room in the middle of the night bearing official-looking documents, did not question the news. He examined the papers, saw his own name on the list of promotions, and immediately placed his troops at Mallet's disposal. The first domino had fallen. With a cohort of loyal soldiers now behind him, Mallet marched across Paris, his audacity growing with every step. His next stop was La Force prison. He used his new authority and his forged orders to demand the release of two other imprisoned generals, Guédal and Lahéry, who were key parts of his conspiracy. The prison governor complied without question. Mallet now dispatched his fellow generals on their own missions. They were to take detachments of troops and arrest the key figures of the imperial government. In a series of swift, simultaneous operations, they succeeded. The archfiend of the regime, the Minister of Police, General Savary, was dragged from his bed and imprisoned. The equally powerful prefect of police, Pasquier, was also arrested. For a few incredible, chaotic hours on that October morning, the plot was a stunning success. A handful of conspirators, armed with a lie and some paper, had effectively decapitated the entire security apparatus of the Napoleonic state. Mallet himself took over the military headquarters at the Place Vendôme. It seemed that the empire, which had taken a decade of battlefield victories to build, could be toppled in a single night of audacious bluffing. The Philadelphian dream of a restored republic was on the verge of becoming a reality. But the conspiracy was about to unravel. Mallet's final objective was to secure the loyalty of the commander of the entire Paris garrison, General Hulin. He strode into Hulin's office and repeated his performance. But Hulin was a tougher, more skeptical officer. He knew Mallet personally and was suspicious of his sudden reappearance. He began to ask questions. "Where is your official order from the military command?" he demanded. He noticed that Mallet's uniform was dusty. He hesitated. Mallet saw his bluff was about to be called. In a moment of sheer desperation, he drew a pistol from his coat, aimed it at Hulin's head, and fired. The shot was not fatal, but it shattered Hulin's jaw. And it shattered the illusion of the coup. The sound of the gunshot, the sight of their commander wounded, instantly turned the situation from a smooth transfer of power into a violent mutiny. An adjutant, Colonel Doucet, who had also become suspicious, recognized Mallet as a prisoner. He acted decisively. He grabbed Mallet, disarmed him, and placed him under arrest. The news spread like wildfire. The emperor was not dead. The Senate had issued no decree. The entire affair was a fraud. The coup collapsed as quickly as it had begun. The retribution was swift and merciless. Mallet and his chief co-conspirators were tried by a military commission. When asked who his accomplices were, Mallet gave a legendary reply that encapsulated the weakness of Napoleon's regime. "You, yourself, sir, and all of France, if I had succeeded." Within a week, Mallet and 12 others were executed by firing squad. The plot, while a failure, was a profound shock to Napoleon. When he finally received the news, deep in Russia, he was horrified, not by the attempt itself, but by its initial success. He was aghast that not a single person, not one officer, not one minister had thought to cry out, "The emperor is dead, long live the emperor." No one had thought of his son, the King of Rome. It proved that his entire dynasty rested on nothing more than his own mortal life. The Philadelphian dagger, though it had missed its mark, had revealed just how fragile the empire truly was. And so we are left with a ghost. A revolutionary ghost that haunts the battlefields, the Masonic lodges, and the secret histories of the Napoleonic era. The Philadelphes, a name whispered by poets and hunted by police chiefs. A hydra with many heads, some real, some imagined. After our journey through their shadowy world, we return to the central, frustrating question. Who were they in the end? And what is their true legacy? Were they a single, unified, international secret society, a grand conspiracy of initiates pulling the strings of history, as Charles Nodier would have us believe? The historical evidence suggests that this is unlikely. There was almost certainly no single, all-powerful order of the Philadelphes, with a supreme council and a perfectly unified agenda. The grand, romantic narrative of a single body fighting a magical war against Napoleon is just that. A narrative, a powerful myth created in the aftermath of a world-changing epic. It is more probable that the name Philadelph was not the title of a single organization, but a banner of convenience. A shared label, a revolutionary franchise, adopted by a variety of different, and often disconnected secret groups who shared a certain set of ideals. It was a name that signified a commitment to republicanism, a deep-seated opposition to Napoleon's imperial ambitions, and often, a shared interest in the language and rituals of esoteric Freemasonry as a tool for organization and inspiration. There were the political Philadelphes, the very real military conspirators like General Mallet, who dreamed of restoring the republic through a coup d'etat. There were the mystical Philadelphes, the esotericists of the Rite of Memphis, who dreamed of restoring a mythic golden age through spiritual initiation. There were likely dozens of other, smaller cells and lodges that used the name, each with its own local flavor and specific goals. They were a movement, a current, a climate of opinion, more than a single, coherent order. They were a revolutionary ghost, whose form shifted and changed depending on the witness and the time. But to say they were not a single organization is not to say they were not important. The true legacy of the Philadelphes lies not in their supposed structure, but in the powerful and volatile fusion of ideas they represent. They embody the central, creative, and dangerous tension of their age. They were the ultimate expression of the marriage between the radical, secular politics of the French Revolution and the deep, spiritual yearning of the esoteric revival. They were men of the Enlightenment who were not content with a world of pure reason. They were mystics who were not content to retreat from the world into quiet contemplation. They believed that a true revolution had to be fought on two fronts simultaneously. It had to be a political struggle for liberty, equality, and fraternity in the outer world. But it also had to be a spiritual struggle, an inner work of transformation to create a new, perfected kind of human being, and initiate who was worthy of living in that new republic. They sought to unite the philosopher's stone with the liberty tree, the esoteric with the political. This radical fusion is their most important legacy. They were the direct predecessors of the great revolutionary secret societies of the 19th century, most notably the Italian Carbonari, who would borrow much of their structure, their symbolism, and their revolutionary fervor. In the end, the Philadelphes remain an enigma, a testament to a time when the world was in such a state of flux that the line between a political conspiracy and a mystical order could become almost meaningless. They are a half-forgotten tale from the secret history of the modern world, a reminder that behind the grand narratives of battles and treaties, there are always other, stranger stories unfolding in the shadows. They were a revolutionary ghost, born from the crucible of light and shadow that was 18th century France. They were a testament to the enduring belief that to truly change the world, one must first seek to unlock the secrets of the self, a forgotten flame from an age of fire, whose true history may forever remain just beyond our grasp, a whisper in the tangled forest of the past. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the secretive and complex world of the Philadelphes. Their story is a powerful reminder that history is often shaped by the societies we can see, but also by the whispers of the ones we cannot. What do you think? Were the Philadelphes a genuine, unified order, or a historical fiction? Let us know your theories in the comments below. If you enjoy these deep dives into the esoteric and forgotten corners of the past, please consider liking this video and subscribing to Driftwood Histories for more tales found adrift in time. We are grateful for your support. Until next time, stay curious.